what I've realized is those who are dealing with self-righteousness, first of all, we never see it in ourselves. If we read about the Pharisees, even as a self-righteous person, I'm like, oh, those people, and yet I'm bearing the same judgment that they oftentimes bore themselves, and often the hypocrisy as well on some level.
People responded differently. They came up to me and they started coming up to me and saying, James, thank you for being honest. And they started telling me their story. And out of that, I said, you know what? Let's figure this out together.
But that self-righteousness issue is a massive issue, and it really does get in the way of being able to have a genuine heart compassion for people who are dealing with deep areas of sin and struggle.
I tell pastors sometimes, if you're not doing help, hope, and healing for heart wounds, you're creating Pharisees, not disciples. Because you're putting people into a situation where they are having to hide the truth and cover it up with a lot of Bible memory, a lot of prayer, a lot of work, a lot of stuff, but down underneath, all of that is just covering up the reality of what's happening here in the broken heart.
The other thing is we don't even know what it's like to truly be loved until we're truly known.
Yeah.
We might know little dribs and drabs, but I for years had that lie in the back of my head that if they only knew you,
they wouldn't love you.
They, fill in the blank. If they only really knew you, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with you.
If the body of Christ is not on the tip of the spear of really meeting the brokenness needs in God's people, we are sabotaging their sanctification process. We are sabotaging the discipleship process.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Whether you're joining us through your connection to Love and Truth Network or through a connection to Transforming Congregations, we are so glad that you're here. And in this particular podcast, we are joined by Pastor James Reeves, and he's doing some really important work, as well as having founded a critical, very important church in the Dallas, Fort Worth area. James has handed off that senior pastor role to another wonderful pastor, and he has some projects that God has been putting on his heart over the last few years in particular, and really fulfilling those, really living those out, doing a lot of travel and shedding light on some very, very important topics that are dear to his heart and should be dear to each one of our hearts as followers of Jesus Christ. So we're going to get into that in a little bit and unpack that. But first, James, we're so glad that you're here. Thanks for taking the time to join us for our Love and Truth Network podcast.
You bet. I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was sitting for an interview a couple years ago, I guess, with you there in Dallas on this project, the most recent project that you've been working on.
Quick, though.
Yep.
Dallas and Fort Worth.
Yes.
Are different cities, and we're kind of jealous that we don't like to be associated with Dallas.
All right. So the church in Fort Worth, I think that's important. Okay, yes. So City on a Hill Church in Fort Worth, Texas,
and anybody
separate from Dallas.
Anybody that's ever lived in Dallas or Fort Worth will understand that.
Yes. It's kind of like I grew up in upstate New York, and I've always known it as upstate New York, but which upstate in New York is usually anything that's north of New York City. But when I talk to people who are near the Canadian border, they're like, you're not upstate New York. So anyway, I get in trouble no matter, even in the areas I grew up in. So anyhow, well, listen, we're glad that you're here. Thanks for the time that you're sharing and will be spending with us. And as I mentioned to you and our audience is used to, the customary testimony. And when I say customary, every one of our testimonies, everyone who's shared in this podcast has shared wonderful stories about how God has redeemed them, kind of what he's redeemed them from. And every story is unique. But the truth is, everybody, whether in our audience, if you're watching or listening to this podcast, you have a powerful story of the way that God has rescued your life. And I think one of the most powerful stories in our culture is somebody who's managed not to be totally scathed by and caught up in, for me, identity confusion and sexual addiction and all that kind of crazy stuff. And sometimes we downplay our testimonies because we feel like, oh, I don't have that kind of flashy, crazy, addicted sort of background. you know what? What's most powerful in this kind of culture is that you've lived a fairly somewhat clean life, maybe without a lot of wounding and a lot of addiction, and you met God, and He's been the Lord of your life. I mean, that's a pretty powerful story in our culture.
Absolutely.
But James, I don't fully know your story, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of that, and then just unpacking and having some conversation afterward as well. So if you'd be willing to share that with us, we'd love to hear it.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a small West Texas town. We lived on a dirt road in a little tin roof house. My dad was a town drunk. And by town drunk, I mean literally brown bag wino. He died when he was 41 years old of his alcoholism. I was 18. And my mother is Jehovah's Witness. So it was one of those environments where I was on my own from the time I was a child. And I was kind of a street urchin, went to school when I wanted to, didn't go when I didn't want to, was in and out of all kinds of crazy behavior. And as I moved into the teenage years, it was the 60s. And so I began quickly mimicking my father's behavior, drinking and drugging, availed myself of everything the 60s had to offer. Just a complete, total pagan. No spiritual input whatsoever at all. And, I'm a musician. I was, doing rock and roll music and drugs and the psychedelics and just everything, and had no really meaning or purpose in life. And in fact, really, it's kind of, I guess in the school, if they would have selected the least likely to survive to age 30, I would probably have been in that category, either killed by drugs or somebody shot me, one or the other. And my dad was an abusive husband, and he abused my mom all the time. And I can remember as a little boy, standing between him and her with my fists clenched, just junk, just really junk. I was not physically abused. He never hit me, although he could have. I was not sexually abused. I was emotionally horribly abused.
Sure.
In the sense of having no emotional input. I didn't crawl up on my mother's lap. She was just a waitress at a truck stop just trying to feed us while my dad drank everything. And it was just, there was no emotional input. I didn't understand how to emotionally regulate. I didn't understand how healthy emotions worked. Just none of that. But at the tail end of the Jesus movement, I graduated from high school in 1972. I was saved my senior year in high school in somewhat of a Damascus Road kind of experience. The Jesus movement has started on the West Coast and actually made its way to Texas. Just like the drug culture had started out there, it made its way to Texas.
Right, yes.
So, we participated in everything that California sent us. And by the grace of God, California sent us the Jesus movement. And so, the Holy Spirit just kind of put me in an environment. By the time I was 18 years old, all of my rowdy friends, drug buddies were either dead, in jail, or in Vietnam. And there I was, kind of going into senior year after quitting school a couple of times, actually. Made it to my senior year, and God just kind of put me in an environment with some Christian kids and their families, and music was that connection, because I am a musician. And out of that, those families just began to love me, and I was drawn to that. I'd never experienced that. I'd never had a birthday party in my life. We didn't do Christmas. My first birthday party was my 18th year from these Christian friends threw me a birthday party. That was the first time. And so I started seeing everything that I had been deprived of, and I wanted that. So I wasn't initially drawn to Jesus, but I was drawn to these Jesus people because they loved me. And they knew me. It's a small town. They knew my reputation. These parents did. But there were a couple of these parents that just loved me in spite of the fact that I was kind of a dangerous individual at that time. And so on December 31st, 1971, with this group of kids, I gave my life to Christ. And it had been a couple of months period that God had just been kind of cultivating my heart. And I knew immediately that for once my life had purpose. I didn't know what that was going to be. But pretty early on, I felt a call to ministry. I had no idea what that looked like. Didn't have any idea. So 6 months after I came to Christ, I was off on a Baptist college campus studying for ministry, right out of the drug culture. I mean, December 31st, 1970, I'd been stoned out of my gourd. December 31st, 1971, I trusted Jesus. So this is like radical transformation. And I hit the ground running. Now, they let me out of high school. They basically let me out. I started off in a small Baptist college that if you could get the loans and work and pay the bills, you could go to school. And I eventually transferred to Baylor. And I graduated from Baylor University with a degree in New Testament classical Greek, which, academically was very difficult. I was actually a Dean's List student at Baylor. But I thought I was stupid, really, because I'd never done school. Anyway, all of this stuff happened, and I got out of college, went to seminary, met my wife my first year in seminary, and we dated that whole year, got married. We've been married 45 years now. Got married in 1979, and graduated from seminary. Was planning on going right into the PhD program after the MDiv, but I was just real tired. A church contacted me about coming and being their pastor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I went, my wife and I looked at each other and we went, wow, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So I told my professors, hey guys, I'm putting this thing off. I'm headed for Fort Lauderdale. So we went down there for 3 years and had a great ministry. Came back to Fort Worth in 1984 when we founded this church, City on the Hill, that I pastored for 38 years. Now, all of this comes together to really the purpose of this podcast, because nobody ever told me that there might be some issues I might have to deal with.
Right, exactly. That was a class. That was the class you missed, right?
Yeah. Right. If they even had the class,
no, they didn't. They didn't have the class. Yes,
they didn't have the class, and in fact, the message was that I got either purposely or subliminally was, now that you have Jesus, all that's the past.
Right.
And it was the past. My life changed. I was redeemed. I was forgiven. But the wounds were still there.
Exactly.
And I didn't even know they were there. I had no idea. So after we came back here and started this church, I went ahead and did my doctorate. And after I finished that, about the time, this was 1988, is when I finished my degree, about 89, these things started coming up from deep down, and I did not know what they were. I was depressed. I was, didn't want to live, really. And I don't know that I contemplated suicide. I think that's a dangerous thing to say, but I didn't want to live.
Right.
And I had 2 small children, had a lovely wife. I had a church. I had all the education, had a world-class education. And I didn't want to do it anymore. And I was 35 years old. That resulted in a period of time of crying out to God, literally hours at a time. Lord, deliver me from this pain. And he didn't do it. He didn't do it. It got worse. And it got worse. And that scares people when I say that, but I said there's good news at the end of this.
Right.
That ultimate desperation led me to connecting with an individual who was an old drunk. He was a drunk. They'd come to my church. He'd retired from General Motors. He'd been a drunk, sex addict, heroin addict, but he was a functioning addict and had kept a good job with General Motors. Retired from General Motors, checked into treatment, got sober. About 6 months later, got saved. He and his wife walked into my church one Sunday morning. We were still meeting in a school. We were a startup church. And he just sat there and watched me. And I watched him. And I watched him do those 12 steps. I watched him repair family that he had broken over 40 years, 4 decades. I watched him humbly make amends. I went, wow, what a man. And so one day I asked him, I said, Chuck, would you spend some time with me? And his response was, I was wondering when you're going to ask. Because he saw right through me. Because he'd been there, done that.
Yes.
And he took me through the 12 steps. And I began to recognize these are biblical principles. You know, I had a kind of a bad attitude about 12 steps because I bought into that whole, oh, it's all secular stuff and everything. And they did secularize the third step. But then these are biblical principles: admitting powerlessness, making amends, taking responsibility,
Right, yeah.
you know, forgiving, being forgiven. I mean, so in all of that, I realized something, Gary. I realized that I hated my father because he cheated me out of childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know that until I had children. And then I began to see what we were giving our children and realizing I don't have a category in me of what it must feel like to be loved like that. I can remember days sitting there watching my two kids playing, and they were little children at the time. My daughter's 41 now, my son's 38, but they were little kids. And just the security that they had of the love of mom and dad and having a home and 3 meals a day and, you know, all those things. And I looked and I thought, I don't know what that feels like.
Yeah, right.
Man,
it's true.
If you allow me to say it, it pissed me off.
Absolutely.
And man, Chuck kind of led me through that to the root, which was I had gotten cheated out of a childhood and I was extremely angry and resentful for it. And I had to then begin to work through how to forgive a man that had been in the ground for 15 years. Because he died 6 months after I came to Christ. In fact, I did his funeral, the graveside service, because there was nobody else to do it. He was a town drunk. And so now I had to go back and figure out how to forgive him who was not worthy of forgiveness. None of us are. He couldn't ask for forgiveness. I had to give it. And that was what I learned through this process, that I could preach sermons on forgiveness. Now I had to actually practice it in probably one of the most extreme situations you can imagine, when the person can never receive it, they can never ask for it, do nothing at all. I just had to figure it out. And so over that time with Chuck, I did that. And out of that, I began sharing my story from the pulpit because I was in the mood for survival. So I just started, folks, I'm going to start telling you what's really going on here.
Yeah,
and
right.
If I don't have a job next week, then fine. You know, I was looking for a job when I found this one, kind of thing. And but people responded differently. They came up to me and they started coming up to me and saying, James, thank you for being honest. And they started telling me their story. And this was in 1992 when all of this started happening right here. And out of that, I said, you know what? Let's figure this out together. So we started doing what we call now freedom groups, but really, biblically, it's the one another process.
That's right.
The one another's of the New Testament, bearing one another burdens, Galatians 6:2. And so we started looking as things would come up, be sex addiction. We started working in the area of sex addiction 30 years ago, because that was one of the first things that came up with some men. And we didn't know what to call it. We just knew there was a porn in it. So we started, started doing that. Sexual abuse. A woman came forward and just said, you know what? I don't know what to do with this. And I said, well, I don't know what to do with it, but let's figure it out. So we did. We offer about 30 different types of groups now in our church. And so all of that started, 32 years ago now. And today we offer about 30 different types of groups. So that's kind of the evolution.
Yes.
And why? That's one of the reasons why I say today that if the body of Christ is not on the tip of the spear of really meeting the brokenness needs in God's people, we are sabotaging their sanctification process. We are sabotaging the discipleship process.
Absolutely. That's so true.
Because if discipleship is more than just memorizing scripture, but it's moving into a deeper intimacy with the Father, someone's carrying the kind of wounds that I carried doesn't have the capacity to do that. And so if we're not meeting those healing needs emotionally in people, we're setting them up for failure. I tell pastors sometimes, if you're not doing help, hope, and healing for heart wounds, you're creating Pharisees, not disciples.
Yes.
because you're putting people into a situation where they are having to hide the truth and cover it up with a lot of Bible memory, a lot of prayer, a lot of work, a lot of stuff. But down underneath, all of that is just covering up the reality of what's happening here in the broken heart. And
That's right.
so that's why for 30-something years we've done the one another process, because that's how I began to move into healing.
Mm-hmm.
The reason the Lord didn't heal me when I cried out to him is because I wanted him to fix me so that nobody else would have to know what was really going on in here.
Yes, been there.
Yeah, I didn't want them to know how angry I was. I didn't want them to know how bitter I was and how much I resented my father. And it was kind of like, I look back and it was like the Lord was saying, James, I want to heal you, but I won't do it your way.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to come to vulnerability, transparency. And when I started doing that, Gary, is when the healing started happening. So I look back on it now and I go, it wasn't that the Father didn't care. It wasn't that the Father didn't want to heal. It was that I was still operating in my pride. And I just wanted God to make me feel better so that nobody ever had to know the darkness that was really dwelling in my heart. And he said, I won't do that. I won't do that. Mm-hmm. And that's where that one another process becomes so valuable, because then we are humbling ourselves before God. We are humbling ourselves to one another. And then the Holy Spirit begins to come in here and he does his work. So
good.
That covered a lot of territory in a short period of time, but
well, it did. And I mean, there's so many things that you shared, James, in that just, I mean, it resonates with me in such a deep way, because my wife and I and others that we've been connected to for a number of years now have been on a very similar journey. And I often talk about what you said about that, and if we're not dealing with those heart issues, with those places of wounding and things of that nature, you're actually just creating Pharisees. Mm-hmm. The way that and that's a very true statement. The way that we describe it is that the church is unintentionally producing double living.
Yes.
The church is unintentionally producing people who work so hard at sort of doing certain things like reading our Bibles and praying. And neither of us are saying those aren't good things. Those are important things. But what we wind up doing when we aren't addressing those deeper woundings and places that, frankly, all of us have, none of us get into adulthood without wounds.
Yeah.
When we don't do that, we're actually producing people who are more concerned about image management than they are about vital life change actually happening at a heart level.
Absolutely.
And they don't know how to navigate it. Like you said, the same thing was true for me when I'd stopped acting out in a lot of sexual addiction, a lot of identity confusion. I still had some significant identity confusion in terms of, what does it mean to be a man made in God's image? How do I live out this gift, but yet this, what felt like, could I give it, this is a gift I'd like to give back, in a sense, this responsibility I didn't know how to even live out. But when I had that sort of under control and I wasn't bound up by the behaviors any longer, I thought I'd arrived. I mean, that's what I've been striving for years to try to get to. And it was the Lord, and I was on staff at a church at that point, and I was on staff because I was living in the light. They knew my story. They knew all the brokenness that God had brought me through, how their counseling and other places I'd been to had been so helpful and impactful in changing my life and shedding so much of this stuff. But no one, including myself, knew of this, the iceberg underneath the surface that was all of the wounding that I had not done anything with and never had bumped into in all the churches I've been in. Now, maybe some of it I just sort of missed, but I don't think it was ever really a topic of conversation that, there's actually something besides just getting saved. As powerful as that is that's a doorway, right, into this kingdom experience of the power of Jesus isn't just to one day get us out of hell and into heaven. That's glorious. But more importantly, it breaks the power and the domination of sin in our lives today. But what do we do with the wounds?
Well, and the problem is we want the wound solved the way we want it solved.
Exactly.
And we want the wound healed the way we want it healed. And that is to protect us.
That's right.
And as long as we're protected, then the Father's going to stand back from us. You know, he resists the proud,
yes,
but gives grace to the humble, the scripture says. And so when we're wanting to hide the secrets, we're walking in pride. Why do I want to hide what I really feel? Because I don't want people to think bad of me.
That's right.
Because I want them to think well of me. I mean, I'm Dr. James Reeves, senior pastor, the icon of biblical exegesis and exposition and all that. I don't want them knowing how filled with anger I am toward my Father. They'll think less of me. So, Lord, fix me so they don't have to know it. And he goes, no, they have to know it.
Right. That's the prescription of healing,
that's
right?
Prescription. Now,
Yes.
That's not to say that he can't do the miraculous intervention periodically. I know people in whom he's done that, but they are by far the exception, not the rule.
That's why it's called a miracle.
Exactly. And the miracle of healing that he typically does is this long process of participating with him in the practicing of principles of healing.
Yes.
Which are powerlessness. That's just the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You know, the first step says we came to know, that we were powerless and our lives have become Emmanuel. Same thing. And then turning our will and life over to the care of him. And, then, doing that fearless searching, moral, all those things we don't want to do. We just want God to zap us and fix us.
Right.
He says, no, this is what we're going to, this is a process. It's not a destination. And that's so hard in evangelical circles to wrap ourselves around because we really want to point to the miraculous deliverance.
Right.
Well, then what if that doesn't happen? What do you do then? And that's where most Christians are.
I agree. I totally agree with you. And, I'm often asked when I'm traveling and speaking and teaching around the country, I'm often asked usually by a pastor, what other churches would you point to who are putting into practice or have put into practice some of the principles that you're talking about and you're teaching us now. And I mean, one of the churches I talk about all the time is City on a Hill. And it's not because you guys did anything. I mean, I came along after you were doing this for decades. And I actually, my first connection with you, James, you might remember this, but I think I had shared this when I was there doing this interview with you a couple of years ago. But I was taking through some of my guys in the men's group that I was facilitating, taking them and myself through the Conquer series, which is a video-driven, DVD-driven series for men overcoming sexual addiction, pornography, things like that.
And be one of the presenters on
yes, yeah, you were in there, and I remember seeing you and a few others that were contributing to that. And I remember with you in particular, I'm like, man, my heart's so connected. Like I knew that you got it, and where so few actually do, unfortunately, that you really got that deeper, just what you talked about, that it's not just about salvation. It's not just about learning good and right information. As important as that is, you obviously are not a slouch when it comes to education, quite to the contrary. But if you can do all of that, and if you don't address the wounding, you're still going to have an incredibly wounded person, maybe saying all the right things, but eventually it leaks out. Eventually that wounding becomes infected, and it affects the closest people in our lives, but also when we're running ministries and things like that. Ultimately, so many are wounded by it.
That number one issue that brought you to that place, but it'll find its other ways.
That's exactly right.
So a guy who's struggling with the unwanted sexual behavior, he may get on top of that.
Yep.
But then it's going to pop up somewhere else. I think it's a funny story. Since you told me I didn't have to really edit myself here, let me tell you the story.
Feel free.
Because I think your listeners will relate to this.
Yes.
Our church always did 2 services, as we grew to the point. Now we do 3 services. But in between the first and the second service one morning, Sunday morning, I was walking down the hallway. And about a year before, a woman and a man, husband, wife, had come, and we had to kind of beat him up. He was a drunk, and she was done with it, and all that kind of stuff. And the end result was we put him into our process, and he got quote unquote sober. And I was walking down the hallway about a year after this one Sunday morning. I'm fixing to go in and preach the second service, so I'm all in my spiritual mode, and everything. And I saw her, and I said, "Well, how's he doing?" And I knew he was not drinking. And she said, "Well, he's not drinking." And I went, "Good." She said, "But he's still an asshole."
Right. Yep.
And I went, "Say no more. I get it." Mm-hmm. So we knew we needed to go a little deeper with this fella, Right. And so, we talked about that openly. Said, "Okay, come on, let's dig down here. You just gave up alcohol.
What a gift.
But your character hasn't changed.
Or it's gotten worse.
Or it's
right?
gotten worse, maybe, because of your frustration." And so, I thought, how many churches is a woman feel free to say something like that to her pastor?
Yes.
And without fear of that I was going to shame her or anything, she just chose those words that communicated so clearly. I didn't even have to ask what she meant.
Right.
And he's still treating her badly just as much as he did when he was drunk. He's just sober now. Mm-hmm. He's not drunk anymore. So that's kind of that whole thing. Is he had dealt with the behavior, but hadn't had real character change.
Yes.
It hadn't sunk down into, well, what is it? Why is it that makes you be an a-hole? Okay. Mm-hmm. What are you angry about? What are you bitter about? What are you resentful about? And that's why I think a lot of times in quote unquote Christian recovery, we're so behavior driven.
Yes.
That if the dude gets past the behavior, he has arrived. Yeah. And I typically say, no, he's just started.
That's right.
We have to.
You can start to think clearly now that you're not being influenced, but now you've got so much more digging to do.
And what is underneath that? What is that root? And so everything in City on the Hill is not just about the behavior. We do recognize, okay, we're going to have to address the behavior, but as we do that, that is not the end all. Mm-hmm. The end all is transformation.
Right.
The end all is character change and the healing that needs to happen that will keep that from popping out in another area of your life.
That's right. That's right. And I think it's so important just to say for those that are listening or watching, you could be hearing what we're talking about, and maybe part of you is resonating with it, or part of you is kind of thinking about sort of what we're sharing almost sort of outside of yourself. But as I said earlier, and James was also agreeing, none of us get out of childhood into adulthood unscathed. Like, we all have wounds that if we've not dealt with them, guess what? They're still there. And you might hear about someone who's a drunk or a drug addict or a sex addict or whatever. And it's like, oh, I'm none of those things. Some of you listening or watching may be like, oh, I am one of those things or all of those things. But many that are watching or listening may feel like, well, I'm so far removed from that. But the truth is, what we're talking about applies to you as well. One of my favorite testimonies on our website is from a woman. Her name is Sherry, who's a dear friend. Love she and her husband and their family. And one of the things that Sherry talks about is hearing my story, or not hearing my story, hearing a pastor, this is many years ago now, when we were bringing an inner healing program into our church, a program called Living Waters, and put out by Desert Stream Ministries, written by Andrew Comiskey. But we were talking about bringing this program in, and we were bringing kind of the mini version of Living Waters in. And one of the pastors said on a Sunday morning, this is about relational and sexual brokenness and finding healing and restoration. And doesn't that include about 99.9% of us? And Sherry's conscious thought was, that she shares in her testimony, is, I guess I'm part of the 0.1%. And yes, and she had no idea. But to Sherry's credit, which is shocking to me, she actually showed up the first night of that meeting, and in the parking lot, she's literally praying like, Lord, I don't know of anything in my life that's gone on or that is going on to which this teaching or what I'm hearing emphasized would really apply. But Lord, I'm open.
Yeah.
And I would just challenge anyone listening to this podcast, have that kind of an attitude, because the very first night when she came in, she just prayed that prayer and she came in and the Lord slew her and the phrase was, when we love others, here's the phrase, when we love others out of a need to be loved, we cannot help but manipulate those we love.
Right.
And boom, she never thought, it never entered her mind that there would be anything really stated that would, maybe there'd be a few helpful tips, but she's like, oh my gosh, I'm in. I mean, she's like, I need this. And she recognized in that moment that there were ways in which this loving out of a need to be loved was actually damaging relationships around her. And anyway, her testimony is awesome.
We say to people like that because we're a growing large church.
Yes.
Not everybody in our church is a recovering sex addict, recovering drunk. I used to say some people come just because I was so pretty. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they hear us talking about this stuff, and they go, well, I don't really have any of that kind of stuff. And so we will always say, well, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so if you put yourself into a place where God can show you, which is what that woman did, He'll show you.
Yes.
And yours may not be some glaring moral issue like some of us others have struggled with, but it still is something that is impacting negatively your relationships with others, with yourself, and with the Father.
That's right.
So just put yourself in the place to learn about yourself, what you don't currently know. We have women that come to our group, our sexual abuse group with Fear series that we're going to talk about in a moment, who come and say, I'm coming here just to support other women.
Yes.
That I've never been sexually abused, because they don't believe they have. And they get into that and their understanding of what sexual abuse is and how broad it can be, that sometimes it's not even a physical thing. It doesn't have to be physical for it to impact your brain in a traumatic way. And all the time, every time we do it, we have women go, I didn't know I was sexually abused, and I've come to understand I was.
Yes.
I'm beginning to connect the dots now to some things about how I feel with that experience that I didn't even label as being a traumatic experience in my own mind. But it didn't stop it from impacting her. And I love to see that light bulb go on for people, because when they get it like she did, like that woman you're talking about, they really get it.
That's right. I mean, her life has been changed. And I would say the thing that she was most set free from, and this was over the course of time, like she pressed into not only the 8-week program, she came for the 20-week program. And she and her husband became leaders. I mean, they were amazing. But the thing she was most set free of was self-righteousness. and honestly, what I've realized is those who are dealing with self-righteousness, first of all, we never see it in ourselves. We like, if we read about the Pharisees, even as a self-righteous person, I'm like, oh, those people, and yet I'm bearing the same judgment that they oftentimes bore themselves, and often the hypocrisy as well on some level. And meaning the double living kind of thing in some fashion. Maybe it's a food issue, maybe it's a substance abuse issue, maybe it's some other way that I'm getting my needs met apart from God in patterns of sin of some kind. And but that self-righteousness issue is a massive issue, and it really does get in the way of being able to have a genuine heart compassion for people who are dealing with deep areas of sin and struggle.
And here's another problem. In our conservative evangelical churches, and I am a biblical conservative, I can make no bones about that. I believe the book, the whole book, nothing but the book. But in our evangelical conservative, we celebrate that self-righteousness.
Yes.
We put that guy on the board.
Right.
Seriously. Because
that's true.
Outside, it looks like such spirituality, such depth of understanding. Yet it's all there covering up something that is really ugly underneath. And so it makes it even harder for that person to ever come to the point of admitting that they do have some struggles, because we've elevated them to the position of elder or whatever without them ever having to go through a process to find out what is under there. And so it's a double-edged sword. Like for me, when I was a pastor, struggling with that, my church was not a safe place for anybody to talk about the stuff I was dealing with, much less me.
Right.
much less the senior pastor. So I'm stuck with, where do I get help?
And that's the norm. That's the typical.
That is typical
today.
That's typical with pastors, but it's also typical with church members. Because we hold this couple up as being the perfect couple. We hold this individual up. He's memorized 6 books of the Bible. Wow, what a man of God. And so without even meaning to, we put him into a place where he has to live a double life. For fear of what's going to happen if he confesses that I'm not that guy you think I am.
That's right.
So, we push him into that secret place. And when a church is open to talk about these issues, and people are open, like City on the Hill, where we discuss these, like we're having you and Denise that are coming in a couple of weeks, and they're going to be talking about transgender stuff. Couple weeks after that, Rodney Wright from Pure Desire, good friend of mine, I'm going to interview him on Sunday morning services about his sexual addiction. We talk about this stuff openly, and when we do that, when we can get to that place, then people are free to not have to be perfect.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Free to step forward and say, you know what? I need help. And okay, let's do it.
That's right. And it's not to be confused with, by no means, and there certainly sadly are churches and whole denominations that are affirming a variety of sinful behaviors. And we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is normalizing the reality that we all struggle with a variety of wounds, sins, etc. And we want to get on until we get honest about it. There's no going forward until we get honest about it, and until we bring it into the light, until we confess our sins to one another, as James 5:16 says, and pray for each other that we might be healed. There is no healing, and so we're not trying to celebrate or normalize this idea of we're just all sinners and let's just kind of que sera, but rather we need to be known so that we can actually walk as an integrated person in the language of living waters, that we're not just living double lives out of all of these different compartments of our life, but we are one person who is integrated. I'm known, and the struggles that I have are known by my band of brothers or my band of sisters as women or whatever, and we're doing life together and we're growing in sanctification on this journey. I just think that's such an essential thing that sadly is not normative in most that I've seen in most churches.
I don't think it is, because we have a distorted biblical view of what the church is.
Yeah.
And if you start with a faulty definition, then everything is going to grow out of that. And what we have to understand is that the picture of the New Testament church is a bunch of people that have been redeemed by the blood of Christ, by the grace of God, who are still sick. Because we live in a sick world.
Yes.
We ourselves still continue to make those bad choices. We wouldn't have most of the New Testament letters if the typical New Testament church did real well in the first century.
That's true. They were correcting error, right? Yeah.
Paul wrote to correct error, immorality that was going on. So these were not, we idolized, these first century Christians. They were not to be idolized. They were like us.
Yep.
And these things were out in the open, and Paul made sure they were out in the open so they could be dealt with. And so when we can bring them out in the open so that we can address them openly, we do give people the opportunity to actually move further in their discipleship and in sanctification. We don't celebrate sin. We don't tolerate it. We simply say, bring it out so it can be dealt with.
Yep.
And you will not be beat over the head with a hammer. You will be surrounded with accountability. You will be prayed for. We'll put you into the process by which you can be honest about that and grow beyond it, so you don't have to hide it anymore.
Exactly. And the other thing is we don't even know what it's like to truly be loved until we're truly known.
Yeah. Yeah.
We might know little dribs and drabs, but I for years had that lie in the back of my head that if they only knew you,
they wouldn't love you.
They, fill in the blank. If they only really knew you, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. So even the sense of love or care or friendship that was there couldn't actually settle into me in a way that really encouraged me to the depth that it could have, because I wasn't fully known in those settings early on, still doing a lot of hiding and posing. That was the lie that was there all that time, and it just reinforced. It was a catch-22. It just kept reinforcing this image management. If you think about it, something you said too, James, a moment ago, think about the idea, if any of us had, maybe a $50 stock, and are we that concerned about losing a $50 stock? If it does it go up, does it go down? Not too concerned about that. But if we've spent all of a lot of our time, a lot of our hard-earned money, and then over the course of years of investment, we have something that's worth, let's just say, $1 million. Well, that we're going to be much more careful about wanting to protect that than we are our $50 stock. And the reason I'm saying it is this: when we've spent so much time managing our image and getting accolades and approval based on this idol that we've kind of put up for others, even for ourselves to relate to. When we've spent so much time and energy and resources in building this up, and especially when we moved into maybe a pastoral position or some kind of leadership position in the church, it becomes even harder to actually allow people to know us, because we risk losing so much. But we have to be willing to say, you know what? I see what the Bible teaches. I'm being devoured by this thing. I can't bear this anymore. I'm going to have to risk being known and finding the help and support I need. And it's actually that step by faith with wisdom that leads to life. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. And we build our prisons, and then we have to live in them. And boy, that's a tough place to live. I mean, I did it.
Yep.
Now, morally, all of the things that I had done before Christ, those were gone. I was able to walk away from those things. Yep. I'm a strong-willed individual. I didn't want to do drugs anymore when I came to Christ. I just didn't want to. I didn't want to drink anymore. I didn't want to sleep around anymore. I didn't want to do any of that stuff. And so I walked away from stuff that I didn't want anymore.
Yep.
But I couldn't walk away from those heart wounds. So what I did as I moved into deeper places of whatever notoriety or elevation in life, to the point of pastor and all that kind of stuff, I had built a prison that then I had to live in. And man, that's a miserable way to live.
It's horrible. And for anyone listening, watching us, you may relate to just what James is talking about, that prison. As a child, we don't have any choice. And often we find ways of coping that are just that. They're ways of coping just because we don't have the ability to make our own choices anymore. We're kind of carried about by the whims of mom or dad or both, or whatever circumstance we kind of find ourselves in. But as adults, we can make choices. But oftentimes those coping mechanisms as children wind up becoming the very prisons that we live in for sometimes years and decades as adults. So
to help us survive,
that's right.
Destroying us. And we've all seen that kind of pattern.
That's right. And there's a pathway forward. Something else, James, that you mentioned that I want to mention here. I mean, this is a vulnerable statement for me to make here, or a vulnerable idea to kind of bring out, because it's really in the last week or two, it's just solidified in my mind. Yesterday, I testified at the Arizona Senate committee meeting on a bill dealing with transgenderism. And so I went to support this bill for detransitioners, that if a company provides so-called transgender healthcare and is willing to mutilate someone's body and give them cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers, et cetera, if you're willing to do that, then you need to be willing to help people detransition when they realize what a terrible mistake they've made. And that is a massive issue. They're just kind of kicked to the curb, left to themselves. We don't want to have anything to do with you now because you're turning your back on us and whatever. And so that was the bill that I was sharing and supporting in. Now, a number of months ago, I had heard someone speak, and I had heard of detransitioners for forever, obviously, and I'd heard the word de-sister. And I kind of thought of those as being interchangeable. And I realized a number of months ago when a woman was sharing her story from years ago when she had such powerful and strong desire to be a boy when she was a young girl. And that was a deep desire of hers, caused a lot of misery in her life, but she wound up getting connected with a counselor, a school counselor, can you imagine, who helped her and guided her to the reality way back in the day that, honey, you are a little girl, and it's good to be who you are, and a variety of different counseling appointments and all of that really helped her, along with some other care, resolve that issue. And so she's known as what is a desister. And I really hadn't thought that much about that either in terms of my own life. But as I was writing out my testimony, and I just wrote my book, my first book on my life story in terms of coming to genuine faith in Christ about the age of 23. And I wrote a little bit about this in the book. But as I was writing the testimony, it occurred to me that I've downplayed a season of my life of probably several years of my life where I really did feel like it would have been so much better had I been born a girl. The things that I was interested in, the characteristics that I had, the mannerisms, the interests that I had, I was always hanging out with girls. I didn't like being with boys much at all. There were a lot of things that I interpreted. Of course, there was no one to talk to about that. And of course, thank goodness there was no trans celebratory ideology going on back then. Otherwise, if I were in today's culture as a 10 or 12-year-old, there's no doubt in my mind where that would have taken me. But my point is, coming back to that, when you said that there are women who come just to support other women and have no clue coming into it that they actually had an issue themselves, that's what made me think about this incident. As I was writing out my testimony and sharing before the Senate subcommittee, I realized in the testimony, wait a minute, this was a bigger deal than I actually thought about at the time, because I didn't go down the process of getting on cross-sex hormones or having puberty blockers or thinking about surgery. I just thought, well, this was just kind of a whim. But as I thought about it, no, this was really actually this was more of a struggle than what I wanted to admit or realized. And in my testimony, I shared that I, like the studies now show, that upwards of 90% of children who deal with some level of gender dysphoria naturally correspond to their biology by the time they reach adulthood, if they're not pushed or encouraged toward transgenderism. So that really is a part of my own story too. But it's crazy to me that I've been in this space for all of these years, and I think about these things, I write about these things, and it just dawned on me, really, in writing out this testimony, even after I'd written a little bit about this season of my life in my book, like, oh, no, this was a bigger issue. I naturally grew out of it, but that's what tends to happen. And I kind of downplayed it because I did kind of naturally grow out of it. But for several years of my life, like, that was a thing. That was something I really internalized and wrestled with.
And the tragedy of what our culture is doing now, which is pushing that, they don't give children the time to grow out of it.
That's right.
They push them.
That's right.
You need to just fix it. You just need to go ahead and accept it and do it. And they make decisions now that, man, in 10 years, they're going to go, oh my gosh, I wish I had done that.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be, it's horrible. It's ungodly. It's what it is. It's demonic.
Right.
Yes. Frankly. It's all.
Yeah, no, it really is. Well, one other thing I wanted to touch base with you about, when you talked about walking through this process in terms of forgiving your father. What can you share? And you're right. I mean, what a challenge it's a challenge to forgive somebody who's living. And, it can be a challenge to forgive them when they come to you and ask for forgiveness. It's even more of a challenge when they kind of excuse or defend their behavior or whatever, when it was actually indefensible, but yet they're alive and you want to have some kind of connection with them, and you don't want all these emotions stirred up all the time. And so there's a recognition. I really do have a longing to forgive them regardless. But when someone has passed and there's significant time that's gone by, I think it's so much more of a challenge to actually walk through a process of genuine forgiveness. What did that look like for you?
I wrote about that in Refuge, which was my first book that was published. I have a whole chapter of what forgiveness is and what it isn't.
Yeah.
And that came out of this kind of experience. Also in Life Change for Every Christian, I have a chapter on that, because forgiveness is that, it's that continental divide.
Yes.
for all of us.
There you go.
When we can get to that point and actually really do what forgiveness really is, you're on the downhill slide.
Yep.
Up until that, you're climbing, you're scratching. But when you get to that point, and it takes time, we oftentimes as Christians, we push people to start forgiving too soon before they've done enough work. But when I came to really understand that forgiveness is unilateral, it always is. Forgiveness is unilateral. Forgiveness does not require the participation of the other individual. Now, we want them to participate. We want them to want forgiveness. We want them to repent. We want them, and we think that's going to make it easier. But at the end of the day, forgiveness is unilateral. It does not involve the other person at all. So really, forgiving someone who's dead or forgiving someone who is alive should be the exact same process. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we want them to want forgiveness. And we think that's going to make it easier. It's not. It's not going to do it. So forgiveness, basically, in the New Testament, biblical definition is to release them from debt.
Yes.
That's what forgiveness is.
It's an accounting term, essentially.
It is an accounting term. And it's just say, you owe me nothing. I have released you from my debt. Because until I do that, I'm wanting something from you. And that drives me crazy because you're not giving it. Okay? And in the case of someone who's dead or someone you don't even know where they are, they can't give you anything. So you're in this turmoil, in this cement mixer of wanting something that cannot be given. So you're the actual prisoner. And, you've heard that it's a trite saying, but it's true. When I forgave, I thought I was releasing the other person. I was really releasing myself. I was releasing myself from that tyranny of, you owe me something and I need to get it. Now, my dad didn't give me a childhood. And after he died, he couldn't give me a childhood. He couldn't give me anything. So what I had to do, part of this process was seeking to understand him some. And that often helps. You can never, it's never wrong to try to understand. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but to understand their behavior. I started to look at my grandmother, where he was raised. She was the meanest person I ever met in my life. She lived to be 102. I thought she was going to outlive all of us,
Yep.
And he was raised by that woman. At a period in time in our culture, the Depression, Great Depression, pre-World War I, all of that, coming to understand what drove him to want to just escape life through a bottle. Didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped me understand him.
Right.
And because I want people to understand me. When I've harmed someone, I would hope that they would try to understand me. Not to excuse me, but to understand me. So, that's a good exercise to try to look beneath the skin and look at the hurt that drove them to be a hurting person, to hurt others. And then just to realize, I'm no better off than he was. When I come to my Heavenly Father, I didn't deserve forgiveness. And I know this sounds trite. I don't want to hyper-spiritualize it. But it was a soothing balm, I guess, to my heart to go back where I was when Jesus found me. I didn't deserve his forgiveness. I'd been, living a life. He didn't ask for me to deserve his forgiveness. He didn't demand it. None of those things. As you have freely received, freely give. And so trying to understand my Father and understanding where I was when Jesus found me, over the course of about a year, I began to realize that I could say, you don't owe me anything. I don't need anything from you, Dad.
Yeah.
And so therefore I can release you. And there's a sense of this just huge weight coming off
Yes.
his shoulders.
So true.
I don't look at him now with resentment. I'm ambivalent, I guess is the best probably thing. I'm just kind of ambivalent about him. I feel sorry for him. But I don't have any, I've even at times been even able to have sympathy. It's hard to hate someone you sympathize with. And look at I passed 41 28 years ago. I'm 69.
Mm-hmm.
My dad died 28 years younger than I am right now. Bless his heart.
Yeah.
And he brought a lot of pain.
Yes.
And there's no excuse for that. But there is some understanding in looking at him. And that was just a release for me. Okay, look at what God has given me in spite of all of that. And I want to walk out of this prison. I just want to walk out of this.
Yeah.
And I don't know any other way other than buy my book and read that chapter.
Right.
There's a lot
and I think that'd be a great idea. I mean, and so just to recap, for me, I know that whenever I wrestle with feelings of unforgiveness, it really is coming back to the understanding piece. I think a lot of Christians misunderstand forgiveness as kind of balancing the scales in some way. And so there really isn't an exchange of forgiveness. There isn't a canceling of the debt, and they don't even realize exactly that that's not been done. And it does still rule their life.
Those scales can never be balanced.
No, they can't. And so I think seeking to understand in a way to kind of soften our own heart a bit, but that's not the end of it. For me, it's always coming back to that the passage, the parable about the one that was forgiven, massive amounts of money, and then goes out and demands this tiny amount of money, and it shows no mercy whatsoever. Well, that's how God views us when we refuse to give somebody else when we've been forgiven so much. So that really helps me understand and kind of recognize, wait a minute, no, I need to forgive in a way that in some small way emulates the Father, this releasing of the debt out of mercy, out of maybe gaining some understanding and softening my own heart. But I want to release that because of how much Jesus has forgiven me of. So, but I want to turn a corner here with you, James, and just you mentioned your book. Mention the name of I don't remember now how many books you've written, but mention the names of some of them that you've written that would apply here. Certainly the one we just talked about with regard to forgiveness, but then the other two big projects that you've been working on in terms of video projects with regard to sexual abuse, one focused for women, one more focused toward men. Talk a little bit about those different resources.
And I'm going to just focus on that. The other Refuge, it was published by Kriegel. It's out on Amazon. People want that, they can get that.
Got it. Refuge.
And the Life Change workbook is a biblically based 12-step. I published that. They can get it from us. What I really want to focus on for the last few minutes is that Fearless Series for women and Fearless Series for men. I referenced the fact that we've been doing ministry of help, hope, and healing to survivors of sexual abuse for over 30 years in our local church without the involvement of therapy. Now, that doesn't mean some of our people don't go to therapists, but we don't have therapists doing the work in our church. We are doing the one another work, and we cooperate with the Christian therapeutic community. We have therapists in our community that send some of their clients to us because they realize they can only take them so far.
That's right.
Eventually, they've got to have some community with other, sojourners in the context of the body of Christ if they're Christians. And so we kind of go. Sometimes people say, well, James, you're against therapy. And no, I'm not. What I'm against is the church
that's right.
subcontracting help, hope, and healing out to the therapeutic community. There's not enough therapists out there to fix all the mess up that we carry. And besides that,
and even if that were true, that still wouldn't be a biblical process, right? All by itself.
It's bypassing the biblical commands of what we are to be doing with one another. And I keep coming back to Galatians 6:2, which we are to bear one another's burdens. Mm-hmm. And that word to restore, when sin has happened, to restore them, bear one another's burdens, is a medical term in the Greek text that means they would use to refer to a bone that was broken and was set. And so we're to be setting the bones of one another in our areas of brokenness. And so having done that for 30 years within our church, I was schooled and educated by a lot of survivors in my church, men and women. And so what I did 4 years ago, started working on to produce a tool for Christian women in the local church to start this conversation. A safe, clinically effective, yet biblically founded tool where the church can take this tool created by a pastor, understanding the pastor, understanding the church, to get Christian women together in the context in a safe environment, start this conversation.
So important.
And give them the opportunity to share their story with each other. They want to do that. They really do. Every survivor I ever met wanted to be heard. They were just scared to death that if they knew, they were going to be rejected, they're going to be blamed, or all those kinds of things. But deep down, there's this deep desire to be heard. And we don't give them a place to do that. Yeah. So when we give them that place, and I designed the series, 5 videos, and some other stuff after it, to give them a place. Did the same thing with the men's series, which, Gary, you were one of the interviewees. Max Lucado is on that.
Yes.
And on the very first one, Max tells his story of sexual abuse at the age of 12.
First time I'd ever heard it.
Yeah.
So powerful.
Talked about it much. He's never shared it in depth as much as he did in front of my camera. And Max didn't have anything to gain by doing that.
Right.
Duh. He did it for guys. And that's why I told him, I said, Max, you don't have any idea how powerful this is going to be for men who feel like they'll always be second class, who feel shame about what happened to them. And look, there's Max Lucado.
Yep.
What God has done with his life.
That's right.
And so Max said, James, I want to do that. I want to do that. So, and also Jeremy Keaton of Focus on the Family, Director of Counseling. Jeremy's a part of it. I mean, there's some heavy hitters. Garry Ingraham.
That's right.
It doesn't get any bigger than that, man.
You're so ridiculous.
and so, but it's to give men a safe place. Yes. 1 in 3 women, all the stats tell us 1 in 3 women will be sexually molested by the time she's 18. 1 in 3. And about 1 in 4, they estimate, about boys. And so you look at the typical church, any pastor or any church leader or any church member that's listening to this, you just start counting.
I know. Yeah.
You start counting. And every 3 stand up. That gives you a picture of how many that have just been sexually abused. Now, in the men's series, we talked about physical abuse and emotional abuse because the brain is traumatized. It doesn't know whether it's sexual, physical, or emotional traumatization. The brain is still traumatized, and a lot of the same characteristics come out. So we broadened it for men. And it's exciting to me to see churches around the country that are implementing the Fearless series and the calls that I get. I talked with a group in Maryland last night. And it's like these guys, after the first meeting, they were slain. Literally, just absolutely. Guys that came in there with a shell, and they hear Max, they hear you, they hear these other guys, and they just go, oh my gosh. And they talk. So the way it's defined is there's 5 weeks of the videos with a by 1 hour small group. Then the second section is an 8-week intensive workbook study with a facilitator, small group, where we deal with shame, we deal with the lies that we begin to believe about ourselves, God, and others, all that. And then after that, the third part, for those that want to continue on, I wrote a 52-week discussion guide that's 12-step based, 4 weeks on each step. We talk about the biblical principles underlying that step, practical applications. So it can be 65 weeks long
for
those that want to do the whole thing. And some people want to, and some people don't. It's on our website, which is fearlessresources.org. Fearlessresources.org. And you can go there and you can look at all. One of the things I've done now, Gary, is I've created a nonprofit that we're taking it into prisons. We're taking it into men's and women's shelters. We're involved right now in the women's unit of the state prison of Montana in Billings, Montana. I was up there speaking at a conference last year at the largest church in Montana. And they took me into the prison, the women's unit. I talked to them about sexual abuse. You know what the stats are of women behind bars that have been sexually abused?
Oh, they've got to be off the charts.
It's 9 out of 10. Minimum 9 out of 10.
Yeah, sure.
And because it sets them into making decisions that for some of them, it ends them in incarceration.
Yes.
So I set the nonprofit up to be able to make these resources available for free.
That's great.
In shelters. I'm going to Arkansas in 2 weeks to a shelter that wants to implement the women's series.
Mm-hmm.
The nonprofit is there to make those materials free for these faith-based shelters. And it's amazing when this one another process is so you can kind of tell I'm kind of fired up about this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm working with Southern Baptists right now with the big scandals. I've done training in 2 states, Mississippi and Kentucky. I'm going to be going to California this year to do some training for Baptist churches. I'm working with the Church of the Nazarene. Mm-hmm. All denominations are in a crisis right now where this stuff has happened in their churches. They didn't know how to handle it. They handled it badly, and now lawsuits are flying.
Yes.
And so they're being dragged kicking and screaming into how do we train our volunteers to recognize when this might happen? How do we give a biblical, godly, loving response when it happens? And how do we give care?
And how do we prevent it from happening in the first? I mean, that's part of the watching for grooming, right?
Training your volunteers that when you're in your care, your volunteers understand the grooming process. They understand how it can happen. But even with that, if 1 out of 3 are going to be sexually abused by the time they're 18, only a small fraction of those actually were abused by a clergy member or while they were in Sunday school.
Absolutely right.
It happened at home, in the neighborhood, and at school.
Sure.
So they're there anyway. So just protection is not enough.
Right. That's right.
Local church has got to be a place of help, hope, and healing for traumatized people. So that's why I created the Fearless series, and it's what I've given the rest of my life to.
That's awesome. James, I could talk with you for easily another hour or two, but our time is coming to an end. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who are watching or listening to our podcast, again, whether you join through Love and Truth Network or Transforming Congregations, we're just glad that you're here. We hope that you've picked up some nuggets from James or from me along the way that will be impactful, that actually you can use in your life, that you can use for a loved one, that you can kind of direct them. Make use of James's resources, the books that he talked about, the video programs he's talked about for healing of abuse for women, for men, and also consider this nonprofit that he has set up. So if you have the means, if this really connects with your heart, donate to that nonprofit to make it something that can provide the funds for him to be able to offer these resources for free in prisons, in other places, shelters where they're desperately needed, and yet they can't afford them. So you can be a part of that as well. So we are so grateful. Oh, go ahead, James.
I always make this offer. I've done 100 of these podcasts and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
If you are a church leader or you're a person in a church that has a voice and you want to see your church do this, I make myself available to mentor, to counsel, to help, to train, and do it for free.
That's
My
great.
time, when I do something, is free.
That's awesome.
I'm in retirement. This is what I want to do. I travel around the country doing this. I do it by Zoom. I go personally, but through fearlessresources.org, you can reach me, or you can reach me through Garry. Garry has my permission to give you my contact information. I would love to be able to talk with you more and help you, your church, to become tip of the spear in this issue.
That's awesome. So good. All right. Well, join us again for a future podcast here of Love and Truth Network, and we look forward to seeing you there. Bye-bye. We so appreciate the time you've just invested with us in our Transforming Congregations podcast. To join us for future podcasts, dial into transformingcongregations.org/podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future podcast.